When the Minnesota Wild traded for Quinn Hughes in December, it wasn't just a hockey move, it was a declaration. That trade didn't just quietly improve the roster, it set the direction for everything Minnesota does before the trade deadline on March 6th. And the early results are impossible to ignore. With Hughes in the lineup, the Wild went 16-5-5. They entered the Olympic break sitting second in the Central Division. This doesn't look like a team trying to survive the season. This looks like a team preparing to buy, and buy aggressively. But here is the important part. Buying doesn't mean buying everything. For Minnesota, this deadline isn't about volume. It's about one decision that defines the window. Adding Quinn Hughes did two things at once. First, it immediately raised the team's ceiling. Minnesota now has a true game-changing defenseman who can control tempo, exit the zone under pressure, and drive play against top competition. Second, and more importantly, it compressed the timeline. You don't trade for a player like Hughes and then wait patiently. You don't protect every future asset. You don't sit in the middle. That move told the league that Bill Guerin pressed the all-in button. Now the deadline has to confirm it. Minnesota enters the deadline with more than $14 million in cap space. That's enough to acquire almost any player available, possibly more than one, and without complicated retention gymnastics. So, this is not a cap-constrained deadline. It's a decision-making deadline, because having money doesn't mean spending it well. For years, Minnesota has been circling the same problem. They can draft wingers, they can develop two-way forwards, they can survive without elite centers until they can't. And now they can't anymore. A team with Kirill Kaprizov, Matt Boldy and Quinn Hughes cannot enter the playoffs without an elite center. That's not a luxury, that's a requirement. Marco Rossi was part of the Hughes package. Joel Eriksson-Ek is valuable, physical and reliable, but not an offensive driver. Ryan Hartman is a depth forward. Danila Yurov has upside, but not first-line center responsibility in a playoff race. This roster is built to support a star center, it just doesn't have one. That's why one name stands above the rest, Robert Thomas. At 26 years old, Thomas is in the ideal age bracket for a top-line center. He's a dominant playmaker who thrives on possession, patience and control. Those traits matter because they align perfectly with Kaprizov's game. In St. Louis, Thomas already plays with high-skill wingers and manages pace under pressure. He doesn't just distribute, he stabilizes lines. That's exactly what Minnesota lacks. Here's the catch. St. Louis isn't selling cheaply. Not to a division rival, not for futures alone. Doug Armstrong will demand a massive return, and he should. That's where Jesper Wallstedt enters the conversation. Wallstedt is Minnesota's most valuable remaining asset, a projected long-term starter, a solution many rebuilding teams would build around. And this is the uncomfortable truth. If you trade for a franchise-level defenseman like Hughes, you have to be willing to trade a franchise-level goalie prospect. Especially when Minnesota already committed long-term money to Filip Gustavsson, the team no longer owns its upcoming first-round pick, and the window is now. Wallstedt is the kind of piece that can break negotiations open, and this is exactly the kind of trade where you use him. Here is the mistake Minnesota cannot afford to make. Adding a secondary piece, grabbing a middle six center, improving the penalty kill slightly. Those are moves for teams unsure of who they are. Minnesota already answered that question in December. This roster doesn't need help, it needs a keystone. Because the most dangerous outcome now isn't losing assets, it's ending up halfway. Halfway means you paid the price for Hughes, but didn't maximize the window and still face massive contract decisions soon. Including Hughes himself, who becomes extension eligible on July the 1st. There are alternatives, but they are imperfect. Elias Pettersson has talent, but comes with uncertainty. Vincent Trocheck brings familiarity with Guerin, but not true top-line upside. And the center market is thin, which only increases the cost of the one player who actually fits. If Minnesota does move Wallstedt, they'll need a backup goaltender. That's manageable. Depth penalty-killing help would also make sense. The Wild sit near the bottom of the league in that category. But none of that matters unless the center problem is solved first. Those are supporting moves. The deadline is about one core decision. The Quinn Hughes trade already changed expectations. Now the deadline has to finish the story. Either Bill Guerin doubles down, acquires a true top-line center and fully commits to this window, or he hesitates and leaves the team exposed between eras. For Minnesota, that middle ground is the worst possible outcome, because once you go all in, you don't get credit for stopping halfway. March the 6th isn't just a deadline for the Wild, it's the moment that decides whether this team is built to contend or built to regret. If this made sense to you, you're in the right place. This is iSense.